All right. Welcome. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. And we believe that that will help prevent the United States from getting entangled in unwinnable and unnecessary foreign military interventions. And in many ways, that is exactly what the war in Yemen is, from the US perspective, at least. We have now a situation in which the Biden administration has promised to end all support for Saudi offensive military operations and also vowed to end the war in Yemen. The question is, can this be done in a manner that actually ends the war, or will it only help end the American complicity in the war? Moreover, mindful of the local drivers of the conflict, as well as resources pouring into the country from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from Iran, is this sufficient to be able to end the war? And if the United States can help promote diplomacy to find a political solution, how exactly should the Biden administration do that? We have a wonderful panel here today with several very experienced voices, and I'm very eager to introduce all of them. We are delighted, of course, to have Congressman Ro Khanna with us again. The congressman has been one of the leading voices in Congress seeking to put an end to the war in Yemen. We also have with us Dr. Aisha Jumaan, president and founder of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. Dr. Jumaan has more than 30 years of experience working in the public health sector and has worked for several UN agencies in Yemen. Also, of course, we have our own research fellow at QI, Dr. Annelle Sheline, who has written extensively on this topic. If you are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function, and we will get to your questions throughout the conversation. If you're watching on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you can use the comment section, and we will try to get to those questions as well. But without any further ado, let's get started. And let me ask the first question of you, Congressman. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Congressman, you have for years pushed to end the war in Yemen and quite successfully passed resolutions that would put an end to the US's support for the war. Those were unfortunately most recently vetoed by the Trump administration, but you have been fighting that fight. And now you have the Biden administration saying that it will end all offensive operations or support for offensive operations by the Saudis. There's some additional detail coming from General McKenzie, who have said that the US would continue to provide intelligence support for the Saudis if it came to attacks by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia. But then he added, what we will not do is help them strike, meaning the Saudis, to continue to conduct offensive operations into Yemen. Congressman, do you have more information of what actually the Biden decision is here, and how do we define offensive capabilities? And in your view, with your years of experience seeking to end this war, is it enough, or is there more that should be done from your perspective?
Well, Trita, thank you for having me. Thank you for your work and the Quincy Institute's work on ending this war. I do think that the online groups and activists have had a tremendous impact in both Senator Sanders and I passing the War Powers Resolution and President Biden's historic decision to say that the United States doesn't support this war, that we aren't going to provide any assistance for offensive strikes. That is not a meaningless statement or a statement that has no value. It's a dramatic shift in American foreign policy that sends a clear signal to the Saudis that they need to come to the peace table with Martin Griffiths and have peace. Now, the Saudis have, as you know, mischaracterized their offensive strikes into villages in Yemen and saying that they are taking those offensive strikes for defensive reasons and almost characterizing every foray into Yemen as defensive. My understanding in reading of the Biden administration is they view all of that as offensive, that if you are bombing a Yemenese village, if you are striking Yemen, that is offensive, and that defensive would literally be if someone is launching a missile into your country. to figure out how that doesn't hurt civilians. And so I think we have to be vigilant to make sure that the twisted definition that the Saudis use doesn't prevail, and Congress will be vigilant on that.
Thank you so much, Congressman. At the same time, there is an argument that says that the definition of only supporting defensive operations is what the Obama administration formulated back in 2015. Is there a risk that despite the clear intention of the Biden administration, that we will nevertheless slide back into that posture in which the line between offensive and defensive is not sufficiently clear?
There is that risk, and certainly there are certain people in the National Security Council we have to have a close eye on. I have a trust in the judgment of Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who actually signed supporting our War Powers Resolution, but they're not acting alone, and we need to make sure that we're vigilant and that we aren't providing the intelligence or operational support to continue any of the strikes, that we're also asking them to lift the blockade that's still ongoing, and that's not allowing commercial activity or food or medicine to get into Yemen. The good actor over the last 4 years, in my view, has been Martin Griffiths. I mean, obviously, there's been a failure of policy, as I think many would acknowledge, in the Obama administration on this issue, and grossly aggravated by the Trump administration. But through all that time, Griffiths has been trying diligently to get peace, and now we have a president who has at least said to the Saudis that their war is morally wrong, and that should give Griffiths much more leverage.
Thank you. Dr. Jumaan, would love to hear your perspective on this as well. You have extensive experience working on the ground in Yemen. How do you see this?
Actually optimistic with the current administration's language and postures. However, like the congressman said, we need to be vigilant. We need to make sure that they act on these promises. We haven't seen anything yet on the ground, and Saudis are still bombing Yemen today and this week. So I don't know when that is going to take effect.
And sticking with you, Dr. Jumaan, another decision that the Biden administration has taken is that they reversed rather quickly the designation of the Houthi movement as a terrorist organization, a designation that was put in by the Trump administration. When that decision first was announced that the Houthis would be on the terrorist list, a lot of aid organizations objected and argued that this would really complicate the situation to deliver aid to the country. But also there are people who have been quite critical of Biden's decision to lift it, particularly with his recent attack against Marib, a very important city to the east of the capital. What is causing this divide on this issue? And your assessment, what is going to be the effect of the delisting of the Houthis?
Okay, let me start by saying a little bit about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. There are 24 million people in Yemen today who are in need of immediate humanitarian assistance. Of these, 14 million are in need of assistance now. In addition, we have 16.2 million people in Yemen who are food insecure. That is every single part of Yemen. There isn't a single governorate in Yemen that doesn't need assistance. Yesterday, I got a report from UN agencies in Yemen indicating that 50% of Yemeni districts are at phase 4 emergency and 5 famine in terms of food insecurity. There are 6.5 million Yemeni children experiencing hunger at level 4, which means they're going to experience high malnutrition and excess mortality, and phase 5, which means they're going to starve to death. The Houthi designation impact, which a lot of organizations have opposed, including Yemen Relief Reconstruction Foundation, will have an impact on reducing the funding of the humanitarian response in Yemen. It will halt the work of international aid agencies. It will freeze the financial services to Yemen. Banks will refuse to transfer funds to Yemen for de-risking purposes. Shipping companies and insurance companies will refuse to deliver anything to Yemen. There are estimates that 400% increase in prices for these companies, and it will also push the majority of the Yemeni population into full-fledged famine. I want to read just one aid agency response to that, and that is Rescue International. They called this pure diplomatic vandalism. Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, when he briefed the Security Council on January 14th, he said this is likely to result in a large-scale famine on a scale that have not been seen for 40 years. He also said there are no licenses that will help, and that the only way to help is to reverse it. Also, former US diplomats and civilians who have worked in Yemen and the region have written a letter to Pompeo in December 2020, in which they said the designation will not advance US national security interests and will undermine the credibility of US counterterrorism efforts. It will disrupt the delivery of needed humanitarian assistance of food and medicine to 70% of the Yemeni population, and will complicate, if not cripple, efforts to bring the conflict to a negotiated end. Finally, the Houthis have no overseas asset that this will impact them. The people who advocate for this have 2 points. One, the Saudi lobbied the Trump administration for it. That's a no-brainer. We know the Saudis will do that. They are the cause of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, as far as I'm concerned. And the other reason is it's a bargaining chip with the Houthis. So we should not hold Yemeni civilians hostages to conflict. We know that only the population suffers, and the Yemeni have already been under blockade for 6 years. Yemeni should not be used to appease the Saudis or punish the Houthis. The notion that pushing Yemen into a famine in order to pressure the Houthis is totally unacceptable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jumaan, and I recognize a lot of those arguments because we have seen similar impacts elsewhere when broad-based sanctions are imposed. It is always the population that is most hard hit, and we have initiatives in Congress right now to review how the US imposes sanctions precisely because of this humanitarian impact. But can I ask you though, because there's a counter argument that says that within hours after Biden announced the reversal of this decision, the Houthis started to attack Marib once again, and that the lifting of that designation may have been seen by them as some sort of an encouragement or a green light. How would you respond to that?
We've heard the Saudi narrative from the beginning of this war. I think it's really time to change that narrative. The Houthis have been trying to get Marib for a year. It's something that they never stopped, something that they planned to do even before the reversal or the intention to reverse the designation. And everybody knows that. Marib is very important to the Houthis and to everybody who's fighting right now because of the resources there. So, and there was an incident in which 6 Yemeni women were abducted and delivered to the Saudi coalition as because they were accused of being spies for the Houthis. This is something in Yemeni culture, and Annelle can vouch for that, is called black shame. You definitely do not deliver. First of all, you do not detain Yemeni women, and you don't deliver them to a foreign power. So that has really enraged the Yemeni population. And I'm suspecting, I cannot say that for sure, is that a lot of the tribes around Marib may have worked with the Houthi to support their recent attack on Marib.
I see. Thank you so much. Annelle, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. There's a very fascinating piece by Rob Malley and Stephen Pomper in Foreign Affairs, which was submitted before Rob Malley was brought into the Biden administration. And they write that the conflict has become so complicated, new militias have emerged, many of them have developed their own economic interests for keeping the war going. And as a result, they argue that perhaps the United States can end the war. Perhaps the United States can end America's complicity in the war, but ending the war may actually be beyond what the Biden administration actually can achieve. Would you agree with that? And can you tell us something more about the driving forces on the ground that we need to take into account if the objective is not just end the American complicity, but also the war as a whole?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to keep in mind pushing back against the narrative that ending US support for Saudi aggression is going to somehow end the war, or that, Biden trying to wash his hands and just, get the US out would somehow rid the US of the stain of complicity in Yemen, because the US is complicit in the devastation in Yemen and needs to be one of the many parties that takes responsibility for helping to fund reconstruction. And importantly, the civil war predates Saudi military intervention. So even if, the US convinces Saudi Arabia to stop bombing Yemen, the war is still going to continue. So this notion that Biden has somehow ended the war just by withdrawing US support is completely inaccurate. It is an important first step, because as long as foreign funding keeps pouring in, the warring factions have no incentive to stop fighting. So it needs to be only the first of a coordinated effort to address the factors on the ground. Another important narrative to push back against is the notion that this is only a proxy war, that this is simply, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because again, the conflict predated Saudi Arabia's intervention with leading the coalition, intervening almost 6 years ago now in March of 2015. So this is not to say that the Houthis would necessarily stop fighting. If the US managed to convince Iran to stop funding the Houthis, that wouldn't necessarily get them to stop. However, it would be very important, again, in allowing the conflict to go back to being an internal Yemeni matter, that external actors can and should and must contribute to reconstruction and help to support an inclusive political resolution. But the first effort has to be ending all foreign funding from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, both presence on the ground, which again, the UAE is still on the ground despite their claims to the contrary. And then once that occurs, then a process can occur within Yemen to actually reach a just political resolution of the conflict.
May I come in at this point
Sure.
in time in response to some of Annelle's points? Jamal bin Umar, who was the UN envoy to Yemen just before the Saudi started their airstrike in Yemen, said that the Yemeni were about to reach an agreement before Saudi started bombing Yemen. So I would say that Yemeni are more likely to come to a negotiating table and a power sharing if there are no interference from international actors. There's a lot of money that's being poured into Yemen for this war. So I really am more optimistic that if the international actors are out, Yemeni will be able to do something. The second notion, which again is a Saudi narrative, that Iran has a big hand in Yemen or with the Houthis. I actually disagree with this narrative. And it was amusing to me to read yesterday a tweet between the Iranian ambassador to Yemen in Sana'a, and one of the Houthi diplomats. The Iranian ambassador was celebrating the Iranian revolution and wrote that he's also pleased to see the success of the Iranian revolution or the Islamic revolution in Yemen. And the Houthi diplomat corrected him, saying, sorry, ambassador, our revolution started 1,300 years ago, and Khomeini learned from us. We didn't learn from you, you learned from us. So again, the Houthis will only listen to the Iranians if they agree with them. They're not going to listen to them if they disagree with them.
Thank you so much for that point, Dr. Jumaan. And let me press you a little bit on this issue, because if it turns out then that the Iranians do not have that level of control, and that is also what the US intelligence has repeatedly said, that the idea of the Houthis being a proxy is not only a simplification, it's inaccurate, because the Houthis are far more independent than that. But your previous point is that we need to get the foreign actors out. Well, the US now pulling out is very positive. We have one question from the audience asking about what the UK has not pulled out, and they're going to continue to do their arms sales. So that's an issue. But also, what to do then with the Iranian support to the Houthi side? What are the leverages to make sure that that also ends, in order to make sure that we get to the situation you talked about, that this is actually something that is internally Yemeni, and there's no outside interference that fuels the conflict. And I would love to get the congressman in on this as well, particularly when it comes to the idea of whether the US, the Biden administration, can do something to convince the British to also pull their support. Congressman, you want to go first?
Well, I agree with both of the speakers that ending U.S. complicity is far short of ending the war. My view is that given our complicity in the past, we have a moral obligation to do more than simply saying we're going to stop Saudi's bombing. I stopped supporting Saudi's bombing. I believe the president should have a very simple declarative statement. The Saudis and UAE need to stop the bombing, need to stop the funding, and need to stop the intervention in Yemen. And we need to have a very clear statement to Iran that no funding or intervention in Yemen is permissible. And we have an enormous amount of leverage over the Saudis and UAE. They are desperate for relationships with the United States, as is evidenced by their large lobbyists and presence on the Hill. And I have confidence Ram Mali has the ability to negotiate with the Iranians. So we need to continue to mobilize for these two very simple statements of U.S. foreign policy that actually would go further to ending the war. And if we were to take those clear positions, I have no doubt that would put pressure on Britain and other countries to also stop any support that they're currently giving.
Thank you, Congressman. Dr. Jumaan?
So a few points. One, in terms of the Saudis, the U.S. support for the Saudis. I always like Bruce Riedel's point that the fighter jets need to change their tires every day when they go flying to bomb Yemen. If we just stop selling them the tires, they will not be bombing Yemen on a daily basis. That's a simple act. But in terms of the Yemen-Iranian relationship, I actually would like to disentangle Yemen from Iran. Again, I do not want the Yemeni and Yemen to be hostage to the negotiation for the Iran deal. Yemeni are in where we are because Obama used Yemeni as a sacrificial lamb, so the Saudi would approve of the Iran deal. So I'm totally against any time anybody tries to link Yemen to the Iranians to the Iran deal. As I said, the Houthis will listen to Iran when they agree with them. So instead of going through Iran, why don't you go directly to them? Why would you go to someone who you know have no control over the Houthis? Go and talk to them. The Houthis have said repeatedly that they want to talk to the Saudis. They view the Saudi as the main group that's fighting in Yemen. Unfortunately, the Yemeni government is also hostage. The international Yemeni government is hostage to the Saudi and the Emiratis. The Saudi ambassador in Yemen actually monitors Twitter accounts of Yemeni government officials and Facebook accounts. And if they say anything that he doesn't like, he actually calls them to tell them to take it off. So we know who is in control in Yemen, at least from the other side. So yes, the Saudis need to stop, and the Saudi will only listen and negotiate in good faith, and the Emiratis, if the US pushes them to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Jumaan. You said something very important, that one shouldn't in any way, shape, or form try to make Yemen linked to the Iranian case or be taken hostage by it, as you put it. And from the perspective of trying to find a solution there, clearly that makes a lot of sense. But there's also the counter argument that at the end of the day, to really be able to get an agreement You need to get the other major powers to come around the table. You need to make sure that the Saudis, Emiratis, Iranians, all of them, regardless of the degree of control they have, they nevertheless control their own interference. And one obstacle that appears to exist here is that the United States and Iran cannot do that until the US is back into the JCPOA. In your view then, and I would love to get both Annelle and the congressman in on this as well, whether we like it or not, is the Yemen diplomacy to a certain extent taken hostage or contingent upon the stalemate over the JCPOA getting overcome?
Again, from my perspective, I would like that not to happen. I would like Robert Malley, I would like the Secretary of State Blinken not to make that conditional, that they would not do anything in Yemen to ease the suffering of the Yemeni people until the Iranian agree to the Iran deal. That should just really be separated. If they want Iran on the table as an observer, as someone that's close to the Houthis, that's fine. But linking those two issues has already resulted in the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. You know, in the recent publication by Mali, he talks about that. He talks, you know, one of the things he said that breaks my heart as well. He said, you know, they were going to do it with us or without us. I wish they had allowed them to do it without the US support. It would not have persisted for 6 years had it been without the US support. Again, I would go back to Bras Raidal. We will not give you tires for your jets to bomb Yemen. So that thing that they will do it with us or without us is not acceptable. And I hope now that he is responsible for the Iran deal, that he also disentangles the Yemen, ending the war in Yemen from the Iran nuclear program deal.
Thank you so much, Dr. I would love to get you in on this as well, Congressman. And I would perhaps add a small distinction. What Dr. Jumaan is talking about is ending the war. What I was referring to more is to get the diplomacy going. Ending the war is separate, yes, without a doubt, and stop the sale of tires and a lot can be done. But getting diplomacy going, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, is this to some extent, is the diplomacy to some extent dependent upon what happens on the JCPOA, Congressman?
Well, explain to me, Trisha, what the linkage is. I mean, why are you saying that whether Iran and us, I mean, I'm for the JCPOA and I can give you that view, but why do you think that impacts whether we can get a peace solution in Yemen?
The argument being that in order to make sure you actually get a political settlement, you need to get all of the various parties to the table. And so far, it's been quite clear the Iranians refuse to engage with the United States on any issue and have enough spoiler power on a lot of issues until the JCPOA issue is first put back into place, which of course the Biden administration says that they want to do, but there's some hiccups right now about who goes first. Perhaps this is not a big issue, but I would love to hear your view as to whether it could potentially be one.
Well, I think we have to have two tracks of diplomacy with Iran. I mean, my view is that we ought to get back into the JCPOA and lift the sanctions, which can always be snapped back because we're the ones who broke the agreement, and Iran has had 100 kilograms of uranium and now has 2.5 tons of uranium, and the policy of maximum pressure has been wrong and hasn't worked. And we ought to be the ones that are trying. It's in our self-interest to make the first move. But that should be totally divorced from the point that if we're going to put pressure on the Saudis to stop the bombing and intervention and pressure on the UAE to do that, that we at the same time, the entire world community should tell the Iranians that they ought not to be in any way intervening in Yemen, regardless of what happens with the JCPOA and any state that is making the humanitarian situation worse in Yemen through intervention, bombing, or funding should be condemned loudly, clearly, morally by every nation of the world.
Thank you so much. And now, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I completely agree with what Representative Khanna was saying, and that's part of why it's so important that kind of the first step has to be ending all all foreign intervention, all funding, all military action by foreign actors, so that it can get back to, so the internal actors on the ground can get back to a place where their calculus is based on their own capacities, as opposed to just, they have endless resources to keep on putting into the fighting. And that will also be very important in shifting the dynamic within Yemen, because at the moment, the Houthis benefit from being able to portray themselves as opposing foreign intervention, that they're pushing back against the Saudis, pushing back against the Emiratis when they come into contact with them. And so there are many people in Yemen who don't necessarily like the Houthis, but they want Saudi intervention in their country even less, especially given the long history of Saudi sort of meddling in Yemen. And so as long as the Houthis can maintain this narrative that we are pushing back against the foreign invaders, i.e. the Saudis, there are Yemenis who will fight on that side. Whereas as soon as the Saudis stop bombing and intervening and instead, hopefully Biden would push that the Saudis and Emiratis and Iran and other countries work towards the reconstruction of Yemen and fund the reconstruction of Yemen. But again, as soon as it's back to an internal Yemeni dynamic, then there are Yemenis who will push back against the Houthis. And so this view that the Houthis are all powerful and they've taken over so much of this territory, excuse me, is partly just the result of this perceived resistance to foreign powers. Whereas once again, if it were to become an internal Yemeni thing, we'd see that dynamic shift significantly.
Very interesting. Dr. Jumaan, you mentioned earlier on that the attacks have not stopped and the Saudis are still bombing. And we don't know exactly when it will stop. But the lifting of the terrorist listing of the Houthis, which, as you mentioned, would have created massive problems for any banks dealing with Yemen and sending in aid. But, the change of that, has that in any way, shape, or form opened up the flow of aid, or is there other problems, including perhaps the Houthis themselves, that is preventing aid from coming in at this point? And what can be done about that?
So as far as I know, I'm not aware of anything the US administration or anyone has done to help with the aid, with the humanitarian aid response to Yemen at this point in time. So this is something that I hope that there will be more action on with all the discussion about what's going on in Yemen. We know that there are a few steps that can be taken to ease the humanitarian suffering of the people in Yemen. One of them is that to pressure the Saudi to lift the blockade and open all Yemeni points of entry, including the port of Hodeidah and Sana'a airport that have been closed since 2015. A population of 30 million people cannot live on aid. So we really need commercial imports to be able to flow in and out of Yemen. We also need to resume the USAID funding to Yemen that was cut by the Trump administration to the northern part of Yemen, where about 70 to 80% of the Yemeni population lives. We also need to I am personally calling on Samantha Powers to support Yemen humanitarian and development needs, as the US played a huge role in creating the Yemen crisis. The Saudi and Emirati need to pay their fair share. They have spent billions in the destruction of Yemen. They should be responsible for reparation and reconstruction. Again, Mark Lowcock said that in 2020, the Emiratis pledged zero funding to the humanitarian response in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia pledged 500 million. However, they didn't deliver a penny of that 500 million. In an interview he did in September 2020, he said about the Saudi, it's particularly reprehensible to promise money, which gives people hope that help may be on the way, and then to dash those hope by simply failing to fulfill the promise. Continuing to hold back money from humanitarian response will be a death sentence for many families in Yemen. So both countries that have played a huge role in the destruction of Yemen are not putting any money into the humanitarian response. And the US, unfortunately, decided to suspend funding. So I would insist that the international community make sure that people who have created the problem in Yemen contribute to solving that problem in Yemen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. we have several questions from the audience that seeks to see if this decision by the Biden administration is indicative of a larger shift. Emil Nachle asked whether this will have if it's part of a bigger picture change on the US's relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I want to get back to that rather shortly. Scott McCann asked whether this is part of a larger effort by the administration to reduce the US's military footprint in the region. And I would want to add to that something that General McKenzie said in explaining what the Biden administration's decision on this was. He said, our interest in Yemen is a counter-terrorism interest against al-Qaeda and elements of ISIS. American national interest begins and ends here. We are not party to Yemen's civil war. So first to you, Congressman, this sounds like a pretty big shift, but is it a shift back to pre-2015 in which the United States would collaborate with the Houthis against al-Qaeda and conduct the war on terror that I think we've clearly seen has not been particularly effective or helpful to begin with anyways? Or is it just a way to try to define the US interest more narrowly in order to further extract the US from this conflict?
Well, I think the jury is out on that. I mean, obviously, and I supported the initial strikes in Afghanistan, but our 20-year presence there and then a global war on terror has led to al-Qaeda spreading out more in more countries and has just as a factual matter not been effective and has put many people at risk. So I would be reluctant to engage in more of that effort unless there was a material, clear, direct threat to the United States, as opposed to unending, poorly defined campaigns that have often end up on sides that were backing terrorists without even knowing about it. But I think there is a larger issue here, and I think we ought to speak plainly. I have great respect for Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan because I think they recognize the errors of the mistakes of the Obama administration. Like I said, they were helpful in signing letters, as was Samantha Power, to support Senator Sanders and I's War Powers resolution. But many of the people making the Biden decisions are the ones who were involved in making some of the mistakes. So it would be like if you and I respect Larry Summers as an economist, but it'd be like if you appoint Larry Summers and say, okay, now Summers has become a Krugman economist and he's going to be very progressive, and I'd say, okay, but are you reaching out to some of the other voices? And so one of the things I'd be curious about is whether Blinken and Sullivan and the envoy have reached out to Dr. Jumaan, to Annelle. Are they listening to voices that understand the region perhaps better than they do, that understand the nuances, that may be helpful in guiding them on the blind spots? I was very struck by Dr. Jumaan having to say, we need Samantha Power to talk about moral reconstruction. Why is that? I mean, I respect Samantha Power, but she was the one who partly was made the mistakes. Why would a democracy need Samantha Power to talk about what's morally right? We need to decentralize American foreign policy. We need to allow many more voices in. The time of having a clique of foreign policy elites is part of what has driven foreign policy decisions that have been mistakes and unjust.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for that. That is definitely music to the ears of many of us at the Quincy Institute that strongly believe that is necessary in order to make sure that we have a foreign policy that actually responds to the needs and the desires of the American people rather than just an elite. Dr. Jumaan, if I could get you in on this, are you advising the Biden administration? Have you been asked to bring in these perspectives?
And this is something that I've always talked about, is the US administration always listens to people who reinforce their preconceived ideas of the region. Whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Yemen, they always bring in people who will tell them, oh, you're right. They do not bring in people who understand these countries well and who are willing to tell them you're wrong. What you're doing is wrong, or this point is not accurate. So I hope that they do this time. The reason I called on Samantha Power specifically, because when she was in the Obama administration, she was supporting the war. When she left the administration, she started tweeting and writing about how this is, a wrong war and unjust war. So I'm calling her now and the Biden administration. Now they've been giving a rare second chance to correct a wrong they've done to the Yemeni people. I'm not going to call it a mistake because it's too big to be just called a mistake. They have wronged the Yemeni people and they've been given a rare second chance to correct that wrong. I hope they take it. I hope they speak to Yemenis of all ideologies, not just to the ones that tell them they are right or tell them what they want to hear. I would love to be speaking to them. I grew up in Yemen. I come from a tribal region. When you talked about AQAP took the town I was born into. And it was the Houthis, to be honest, that defeated them in that area. They also, the AQAP, were in one of the hardest areas to reach in Yemen, very much like the Trita Parsi caves in Afghanistan. It's in Haifa, and that's again about 20 miles from where I was born. And they were there for many years. That's where Al-Awlaqi hid. And it was Ansarullah, the Houthis, who and rooted them from that area this summer. So I think the Yemeni, I agree with the congressman, the people of each country can defeat these elements if we don't see drone strikes killing innocent people.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Annelle.
Jump in on that, and to go back to something, Trita, you had said, that General McKenzie had said, I think it would be very problematic to just view Yemen through the counterterrorism lens. We've seen how destructive it has been for the past 20 years when the United States views the entire region through this sort of black and white, who's a terrorist, who's not a terrorist, and doesn't understand the extent to which the previous president, Saleh, sort of used the threat of AQAP in his territory to get funding from the United States to go after them when he would not in fact address the threat, but would simply benefit from all that money. And so going forward, I think it would be a huge mistake to continue that. As Dr. Jumaan said, the Biden administration has a rare second chance here. And I say not only on Yemen, but a second chance to rethink prioritizing things only through this terrorism lens, as General McKenzie said. I think an alliance with the Houthis would be a huge mistake. It would be akin to the US partnership with the Taliban in the 80s, and we all know what happened as a result of that. And so going forward, the US needs to support a political resolution in Yemen that brings in all relevant actors, that does not simply reflect the fact that currently the Houthis are holding a lot of territory. And so if we were to come to an agreement right now, the Houthis would come out the winners. And the reason that shouldn't happen is because it won't be sustainable. Many people within Yemen will not accept Houthi control. And so this, if Biden is in any way tempted to try to work out a really quick agreement that gives the Houthis a lot of power, it's not going to last, and it will simply result in more bloodshed down the road. And so it is very important that the US and the international community, many of whom are responsible for selling the weapons to the Saudis, Emiratis, members of the Arab coalition that have been attacking Yemen, as well as Iran, all of these countries are responsible for contributing to and paying for the reconstruction of Yemen. And the way, one final point on that, I think it would be very important in terms of empowering local actors that reconstruction funds should be tied to the maintenance of small local ceasefires, so that local actors on the ground can take responsibility for maintaining the peace and receiving their reconstruction funds if and when they are able to prevent conflict from breaking out again. Because this is crucial for shifting the incentives that, as Malley and Pomper said in their excellent piece for Foreign Affairs, at the moment the incentives are lined up to keep fighting, and there's a war economy operating on the ground that people are getting rich from. And so moving forwards, it's crucial to stop the foreign funding pouring in that's contributing to that dynamic. And then once that has happened, happened, inshallah, then to incentivize ceasefires by making reconstruction funding conditional on maintaining those small local ceasefires, which can be maintained by local actors on the ground.
Thank you, Annelle. I think that's an excellent point. But I think we should also keep in mind that we have to be careful not to create a situation in which those local ceasefires are only there as long as there's money coming in from the outside. Ultimately, we have to transition to a situation in which the security and the stability of the country is upheld by the people themselves without any incentives or disincentives from the outside. But what you're pointing out is probably a first necessary step towards that situation. I want to go back to the congressman, but also hear your views on this analysis. You've written extensively on Saudi Arabia. You mentioned that we need to take a step back and think a little bit bigger. And what Dr. Jumaan has been mentioning here is really, I mean, the last couple of years and what happened with the decision to actually support the war in Yemen gives us a lot of different lessons to be learned of what not to do going forward. And what Rob Malley and Pomper write quite honestly in their piece is to show that a critical component was to essentially reassure the Saudis at a moment when the US was negotiating the JCPOA and the Saudis were very much against that, that the United States was still going to be there for Saudi security. That reassurance did not reassure the Saudis, did not change their position on the JCPOA, and did not in any way, shape, or form change the course of the war in Yemen. It's still a disaster. Given that, both Congressman and Annelle, how would you see that we need to restructure our relationship with Saudi Arabia, that it is not contingent upon us giving reassurances, which essentially mean our reassurance was to, in order for one deal to prevent a nuclear weapon, we had to green light a war. That is not an option the United States ever should accept to have to choose between. So Congressman, how do we restructure this relationship so we don't face those type of situations? And certainly none of the civil populations, in this case, the Yemeni, would have to face to become what Dr. Jumaan quite correctly called becoming a sacrificed lamb in this.
Well, we need to rethink our approach to foreign policy and move away from a paradigm, I think, which I would describe as Kissingerian, which says that we want to do everything to prevent a hegemon or dominant power from emerging in a region and engaging in a balance of power calculation, which has driven so much of our policy, from supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran to our concern with Iraq to now viewing the Saudis as a check to Iran. Of course, Kushner took it to a caricature, but the point is that this is the thinking that has in part guided foreign policy over the last 30, 40 years. And we need to change that with a foreign policy that centers human rights, that centers the authentic aspirations of people in other countries. I know your name is Quincy Institute, and many people read Quincy Institute to think non-intervention, but Quincy was not about simply non-intervention. He was for non-military intervention, but he was for supporting the democratic aspirations of people through non-military means. And this thread of human rights, I think, is so important. And I think it's tied, and then I want to hear from others, but I think it's tied fundamentally to the diversity of those who are in decision-making. It strikes me as deeply odd that in almost every other domain of American political life, we appreciate the importance of diversity, not just diversity of perspective, but fundamental diversity. I mean, we would never countenance not having policy towards African-American communities without African-American representatives. It would be outrageous, or to have policies about gender inclusion without any women there. And yet somehow we think that diversity of perspective, which is probably actually more necessary in foreign policy, where we aren't even part of the same country, same history, same culture, somehow we think that it's not necessary. Well, that is deeply flawed. And in a nation which has 60% white, non-Latino white, which is the most multiracial major power, for us to have still such a disconnect between the foreign policy apparatus and the rich diversity and diasporas we have, is a real failure of imagination.
Thank you, Congressman. Annelle, could you chime in on this as well, and particularly focus on how this should restructure our approach to Saudi Arabia, but also how are the Saudis reading all of this right now? I mean, I assume there's quite a lot of anxiety in Saudi Arabia as a result of some of these decisions. How is this affecting Saudi decision-making? Is it affecting the influence and power of MBS?
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to what the Saudis are doing. You know, yesterday, the famous human rights activist Loujain al-Hathloul was finally home with her family, which is fantastic news. However, there are many hundreds of Saudi activists and even just innocent people who remain in prison and subject to torture and all kinds of abuse. So not to forget about them, but it is an important, it says a lot that Saudi Arabia decided to finally release Loujain after her imprisonment for 1,001 days. So clearly the Saudis are on notice and are nervous. I think it's unfortunate that Biden has, as you said, Trita, has continued to sort of signal reassurance that the US is going to maintain support for Saudi defenses, because I think that then isn't as clear as just stating very clearly for Saudi Arabia, look, things have shifted and you should not conduct your policy in a way that assumes that the US is going to back you up on these things. This ties, for example, to what we observed after the attack on Saudi oil facilities, when there were crickets from the Trump administration. And after that, we saw Saudi Arabia quietly reaching out to back channels with Iran to try to reduce tensions, knowing that if the US isn't there backing them up, the Saudis don't want a war. MBS doesn't want to have to actually fight Iran. Hopefully has learned his lesson in Yemen that wars tend to not turn out quickly and resolve easily the way the US has so frequently, unfortunately, assumed they might. And so moving forward, I think it's crucial that Biden be very clear with the Saudis and the Emiratis. The US is not interested in maintaining the same status quo, US being the largest power in the region, that moving forward, it would be in the region's interest, it would be in MBS's interest and MBZ's interest and in Iran's to all work together to address their shared challenges. I mean, moving forward, we're likely to see oil prices continue to remain low. All of these countries remain completely dependent on oil. And as the world shifts away from a petroleum dependent economy, these countries are going to have to find another way to function and to feed and employ their citizens. And this is something that they all share. So moving forward, I think Biden should make it abundantly clear that the United States is no longer going to do the bidding of local actors on the ground, including Israel, and that it is in all of their mutual interest to come to a regional security agreement that allows them to spend less of their reduced budgets on the military and instead to focus on investing in their people. And this is something that I and my Quincy Institute colleague Steve Simon wrote in a report that we released in early October on the anniversary of Khashoggi's brutal murder, calling for what the US, what should be US policy towards Saudi Arabia, which should be quite different than the signals that Biden has been sending so far.
Thank you so much, Annelle. We have spoken a lot about Saudi Arabia, about Iran. I want to give the last couple of minutes to Dr. Jumaan to perhaps also tell us a little bit more about another actor externally that has been quite involved, claimed no longer is, but apparently still is, and has in some ways flown under the radar. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Emiratis are doing in Yemen and how that angle also needs to be addressed in order to be able to come to a peaceful solution in Yemen?
That's something that's quite interesting, that their PR firms have been extremely successful in shielding them from criticism about what they're doing in Yemen. So they claim that they have left Yemen when in fact they control Aden Airport. There is a section in Aden Airport only the Emiratis can get into. A friend of mine who is an academician just flew back to Aden last week, and they were being harassed at the Aden Airport because they're from the north. And one of the passengers tried to defend them. And so they called in the Emirati person to stop this person who was defending Yemeni for flying into Yemen. So the Emirati representative came to the Yemeni who was defending the others and wanted to jail him. He told him, you'll benefit from staying with us for a few days. Luckily for this Yemeni man, he had a blue passport that says on it, United States of America. So he pulled out his American passport that actually saved him from being jailed. That's what happens to Yemeni who fly into Aden. They are under the control of the Emiratis. They also are in Bilhaf, in Shabwa, which is the oil fields. They're also in Rayyan airport in Mukalla, in Hadramaut. They're also in Hodeidah, supporting one of the militias there. They're also, as we know, have a huge number of loyal militias to them, especially in the south and in Hodeidah. So the Emiratis, they also control Socotra Island. They have even changed the calling code for Socotra from the Yemeni to the Emirati calling code. And they have been trying to bribe the local population by giving them UAE passports. They're changing the curriculum of the island for the children. They're also in Maymun Island. So they're all over Yemen. And they're also fishing in Yemeni water in ways that Yemenis never fished before, because Yemenis don't have the big equipment to overfish in their waters. The Emiratis are able to do that. So the Emiratis have a huge role and a very much damaging role in Yemen, yet we don't hear much about them because they've had really some very good people in terms of public relations from hiding their atrocities in Yemen.
That sounds almost like a creeping annexation that has completely flown under the radar. Thank you all so much. And I want to echo what the congressman said earlier on. Had it not been for the work of many advocacy organizations, congressmen and his allies in Congress, from Senator Bernie Sanders to Mike Lee and many others, we would not be in the situation in which the Biden administration would have the political space to make the decision that he just did. And I encourage and hope that they will continue to do so that we go from not just ending US complicity in the war, but ending the war and hopefully finding a political solution to that conflict in Yemen as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us as well. But before I let you go, I just want to quickly plug our next webinar that will take place on February 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will be a webinar on how to make US-China trade help Americans and the world. And we will have speakers from the US-China Business Council, Anna Ashton, Jake Werner from Boston University, QI's own Rachel Esplin-Odell, and it will be moderated by Stanford University's Graham Webster. If you have not yet signed up for our mailing list, please go to quincyins.org. Sign up for the mailing list and you will get notifications of all of our upcoming webinars, as well as our other events. Hopefully will be more of them after COVID, as well as our publications. But for now, thank you so much and hope to see you all